Hi everyone. I wanted to begin to share some of my story. A lot of people have been asking me about my story recently, and I to begin to share some of the stories of my life. And unusually, I've had, which I'm sure many of you feel as well, I feel like I've lived already 100 lives, and I have 100 more to go, I'm sure. I've had a very, very colourful history, and it started with a bang, and I wanted to start to share some of my story from the beginning. And what stimulated me deciding to talk about it today is that I watched recently a series called Call the Midwife, which is a UK series of midwives based in the 1960s in a very poor area of London. And one of my favorite episodes of all time, or the one that makes me cry the hardest every time, is series 10, episode 7. And I think one of the main reasons it makes me cry, there's a lot of episodes that have made me cry, but this particular one is that it centers around the issues of Down syndrome and bringing Down syndrome babies into the world. And people might think, oh, well, why would that affect someone like me? Well, going back to the beginning, I was born with extra fluid on my brain, and the fluid was increasing. And this was an issue because back then, at that time, these days, they just put a tube in a child. It's quite a simple procedure. There's a tube to drain the water from the brain if there's extra water on a baby's brain. But back then it was a more dangerous or a more unique procedure that my parents weren't comfortable with. And so the fluid in my brain increased. And the doctors were getting very, very concerned because they didn't have parental consent to drain the fluid from my brain. And they explained to my parents at the time that if the fluid was not drained and it increased any more, that I would become like a child with Down syndrome or a severe intellectual disability. Obviously, Down syndrome is an extra chromosome, which I didn't have, but that's how they described it to my parents. I would be with someone with a severe intellectual disability. So what happened is that my parents, who were very religious, they got the church to pray, and instead of giving me the operation or making me have the operation. So every day the church prayed and they got the whole congregation involved. And I had to go and see the doctor day after day, and they would measure my brain. And basically the doctor said to my parents, if even there is 1 more millimeter of water, or the head measures 1 more millimeter, that the decision to operate would be taken away from them and they would do it. So the hospital and the doctors would take over and the parental decision would no longer apply. So Mum took me back to the doctor day after day, and it still measured the same. And the church kept praying, and then a week later the doctor said, well, it hasn't grown, so let's leave it a few days. And in a few days it still hadn't grown, and in a week it hadn't grown, and in a month it hadn't grown. And it was amazing, but my head was still open. Usually around a year, I understand. So babies' heads, when they're like you're born, that the skin's over the head, but the crown is quite open until around a year. That's what I understand it to be. And then it closes. So then, because that's why we need to be so gentle with babies' heads. But mine didn't close until my 4th birthday. And it was quite remarkable because the doctors were gobsmacked about that the fluid just didn't go away, but it just didn't increase anymore in size. And the doctor eventually said, hey, come back once every 6 months and then once every year. And essentially nothing happened. And this may be a testament to the power of prayer, but most importantly, it's interesting about how this incident has completely crafted a lot of my life, especially my earlier life. So because of this story and the fact that I have a rather large head, it's a very big head. So when I eventually graduated from university, I had to get the largest men's size cap, and it barely fit my head, and no hats fit my head. And I'm very blessed because I have curly hair. I've always had curly hair, so it covers up a multitude of evils or sins. But so the cap, so I have a rather large head, and that hasn't disappeared. But the story of my childhood was that essentially my parents said over and over again I had an intellectual disability when I didn't. But this is the story and the meaning that was made from this incident from my birth. And so I grew up with the idea that I was stupid, that I was not intelligent at all, and the only possible reason why I eventually got good grades at school and university was because I worked hard. So the idea was developed, and I firmly believed that the only reason why I eventually got into law school is because I worked hard. And I did work hard, but I was not intelligent at all, and I truly believed that. This story really lasted, and the feelings of complete unworthiness and lack of being good enough, it really pervaded my mind and my capacity to feel good about myself. I continuously at law school felt like I was a complete fraud and that I should not be there. And to the outside eye, they might not see that because it was covered in this bravado that I had, and I was quite an activist as well during law school, but it was a bravado act, and it took many years, including the help of a very trained psychologist in child protection, and I have many other stories I'm going to share another day, but I wanted to start with this one. With the help of psychology, and then through a number of healing work and healing modalities that I did to really understand the core root of where this idea that I'm stupid comes from. And it really wasn't until my mid to late 20s that I actually felt smart, that I actually genuinely felt smart. I've always been smart, I know that now, but I never believed it. I never ever believed it, and just not feeling worthy most of my life. So that's a big puzzle piece and a big part of me. It's interesting that it is still a part of me because I've done the healing work and I feel very comfortable with my mind and my functioning these days, but I still feel a part of me is like a person with an intellectual disability, that part of me still is that, and I still connect to that strongly. And yeah, seeing it represented beautifully in a TV series, and I think this particular TV series, it's like everything I could ever want in terms of family still loves the boy with the Down syndrome and his gifts just as he is. And so that little connection, that's still that part of me that still is disabled, loves that idea that that she is surrounded by a family that loves her despite her disabilities or despite her incapacity to be normal or to be abnormal. It's really interesting that I still get affected by this, and even though the decades of work I've done on this, it still affects me, and it's beautiful. It's still a part of me, and that little girl that still wants to be loved for exactly who she is, with disabilities and all. And that is part one of my story, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the coming weeks.